Hello everyone, I am Fauve de Bakker and I am delighted to record this presentation for the Symposium on Multilingual Approaches to Assessment and Education. I will be presenting on behalf of my colleagues, Professor Koen van Gor, Professor Piet van Avermaat and Professor Stef Slembroek as well. In this presentation, I will first provide you with some context before elaborating on the concept of functional multilingual assessment and highlighting the empirical data we have found so far. And lastly, I will identify some opportunities and challenges based on our research for the field of multilingual assessment. I will start this presentation with some information on the research context where this study took place. This presentation is based on research results from the MULI project, a research project on multilingual assessment in education in Flanders. And Flanders is the northern part of Belgium, a small country in Western Europe. In Flanders, on average in 2019, 18% of students speak another language at home than the language of instruction. The proportion of L2 students is mostly larger in urban regions, and the Flemish context provides us with a research setting in which we can not only observe a diversity of languages present in the classroom, but also one in which the mastery of both L1 and L2 varies depending on the migration history of the family. Flemish education is characterized by freedom of education, with teachers being at liberty to design their own pedagogic approach and assessments. And in the absence of nationwide standardized tests until now, teachers and the advice they offer play an important role in the orientation of students. In Flemish education, the level of ethnic school segregation is high, and in secondary education, ethnic minority students are overrepresented in the lower esteemed study tracks, especially in vocational education. Noteworthy is that in the context of Flemish primary education, students are taught by one teacher who teaches all subjects. So one teacher in primary education teaches language, science, mathematics, arts, and so on. And therefore, teachers tend to know their students and their academic functioning well. L1 and L2 speakers are in the same classrooms, taught by the same teachers, and are expected to attain the same goals. This model will be our guide for this presentation. And in this model, it is suggested that a shift on two axes can make the assessment of multilingual learners more fair and more valid. What we are currently doing is assessing learners by measuring their competences by means of monolingual tests. And it is suggested that when we shift on the horizontal axis and provide students with linguistic accommodations, we can make the assessment of multilingual learners in traditional tests more fair and more valid. There are a number of possible linguistic accommodations, but in our research project, we focused on written bilingual tests and read aloud accommodations. For the MULI project, we went to 35 primary schools in Flanders and tested over 1,000 pupils in 5th grade of primary education. Pupils filled in a background questionnaire and took a computer-based science test, which was based on the TIMSS released science items of 2011 and consisted of 43 multiple choice items. Pupils were randomly assigned to 4 research conditions: a non-accommodated test, a test in the language of schooling with audio support in that language, so they could listen to the questions in Dutch, a bilingual test in which the written translation was simultaneously displayed, and a bilingual test in which the students also got audio support in both their L1 and in the language of schooling. We investigated pupils' perspectives on these accommodations by means of interviews with 35 students and the effectiveness of the accommodations on the students' test scores. And I will start with the pupils' perspectives. So this pupil touches upon the central idea of this research in his quote, namely, how can a pupil demonstrate what he knows or is able to do without the accommodation? So the pupil says, because then if they can't do Dutch well, you don't get those aids. And the teacher doesn't even know if he can do it well. And if he eventually does need those aids, but he doesn't get them, then actually he would have worse scores. With those aids, he may get better scores. Another quote from a pupil. So this pupil said that the accommodations could increase participation in the classroom of pupils who would be otherwise excluded from the assessment. And moreover, it could help him learn more words. I think I would find it okay because Mohsin can actually already get to know some difficult words. And then he can already learn more and know everything more and faster. And so he can actually join in a bit more with us. And there's actually a myriad of test-taking strategies that can be observed among students who received a set of accommodations. So in our case, it was the audio in both the language of schooling and the L1 of the pupil and the written translation. And pupils often start reading in Dutch and use the translation when they experience difficulties to understand a specific word or a specific question. This pupil, for example, says, yes, because of that, I could answer in Dutch. I didn't understand some words, so I looked at the Turkish questions, and so I could answer. And then the interviewer asked, and if there were no difficult words, did you look at the Turkish questions as well? Oh no, just the Dutch ones. So how did you solve it? Where did you look first? First, I looked at the questions, and in what language did you look at the question? First, I looked at the Dutch ones, and then if I didn't understand, I looked at the Turkish questions. So people often fear that allowing or stimulating the use of other languages than the language in school would cause pupils not to use the language of schooling anymore. And this fear appeared unjustified for most of the pupils that we interviewed. They say they feel more competent to take a test in Dutch than in their L1, but their L1 helps them and supports them to better understand the question. And pupils also use the translation to learn new words and to learn how to pronounce them, both in Dutch and in their L1. So what results did we find in terms of effectiveness? The univariate analysis of variance shows no differences between accommodated and non-accommodated groups. So the randomized accommodation did not significantly improve the test score of multilingual pupils. But in the present study, the frequency in which the oral accommodation, so the read aloud accommodation, was used is not particularly high. So in the language of schooling, this was about 5% of the available audio options. And for the L1, this was about 9% on average. So the average use shows that this is possibly one of the explanations why we did not find a significant difference between the groups. Even though the pupils received video instructions to stimulate them to make use of the accommodations, this may not have been sufficient. And the results from the present study also indicate that possibly all accommodations should be familiar to the pupils at the moment of assessment in order to be able to discover their full potential. But what is particularly interesting is that the pupils' science achievement significantly increases when they are more proficient in their L1 and when they make more frequent use of the read aloud accommodation in their L1. And quite interestingly, the direct effects of both proficiency in L1 and audio support change in important ways when we consider their interaction effect. So the effect of the proficiency in L1 is actually entirely dependent on the extent to which pupils used the read alouds. So for those who did not use the read alouds at all, the impact of their proficiency in the L1 became insignificant. But for those who use the read alouds often, the beneficial effect of using the audio support in L1 on the science achievement becomes more pronounced when those pupils are more proficient in their L1. And then for pupils who use the read alouds only in a limited fashion, this accommodation seems to function rather as a distraction than as a support. So we can conclude that there is no one size fits all approach. So on the horizontal axis, we already suggested a shift towards using the entire language repertoire rather than conducting monolingual tests. But this shift alone is not enough. Accommodations are also being criticized for coming from a monoglossic perspective and continue to rely on static constructs of languages. Pupils are often granted these aids only on a temporary basis until they become proficient enough in the language of schooling. And for example, Ilana Shohami has addressed the problems resulting from viewing multilingualism as a temporary shortcoming that should be compensated for. Nevertheless, we believe that lessons can be learned from using the assessment accommodations and that we can build on these experiences. On the vertical axis, we suggest a shift from a testing culture towards an assessment culture. And an assessment culture is actually beneficial for all learners. So in classroom-based assessment, the assessment can supply proof of what has been learned, whether students are achieving their learning goals, but also information for learning, which teachers can use to inform their teaching and provide feedback to students on how to improve their work. But unfortunately, large-scale standardized testing has been systematized to a level where it does not benefit the learning process anymore. And classroom assessment can enhance teacher judgments about the student's competence by providing recent evidence in a variety of forms gathered at different times. So it is different from large-scale or standardized testing, and especially relevant is the fact that classroom-based assessment is more than just one single test at one moment in time carried out by a teacher, but that a variety of measurement types can be used to gather information at more than one point in time. So let us compare teachers' judgments about students' competence to a test with linguistic accommodations. What does the data tell us? Well, first of all, in the review of empirical research on teacher expectations, Jassim and Harbour show that teacher expectations are generally accurate in the sense that they predict but not cause the student achievement. However, teachers tend to experience more difficulty in correctly assessing the competences of stigmatized social groups, which in turn can lead to negative effects on teacher-student interactions and student achievement. And as Jassim and Harbour point out, there are few studies thoroughly investigating teacher expectations of stigmatized student groups. Teacher expectations that have investigated this have mostly focused on either gender or race. And in the present study, we focus on students that are considered a stigmatized social group, but that have rarely been investigated in this light. So students with a home language that differs from the language of schooling. And as Flanders has no traditions of standardized testing until now, teacher expectations and their judgments are actually the equivalent of test scores in countries that do use standardized tests for high-stake decisions for these students. So in other words, the Flemish teacher expectations and the judgments, they have severe consequences for both L1 and L2 students in their classroom. So Flemish teachers were asked how well they expected their students to perform on a science test. And then we examined the accuracy of the teacher expectations and investigated whether this differs according to students' linguistic background and test accommodations. And we found that teacher expectations tend to be higher for L1 Dutch speakers than for students from other linguistic backgrounds. The teacher's expectancy of excellence scores is lowest for students with Turkish backgrounds, followed by students from other linguistic backgrounds and for students with Polish backgrounds. The percentage of L1 speakers of the language of schooling that was accurately appraised by the teacher is higher than Turkish, which is about 33% compared to 41% for L1 speakers of the language of schooling. For Polish, this was 23%, and for other students or students from other linguistic backgrounds, 32%. So while students from other linguistic backgrounds test scores were most often overestimated. Polish students' test scores were least accurately predicted by their teacher and were most often underestimated. The students who used the read aloud accommodations in the L1 performed better than expected by their teacher, and they were more often underestimated than students who did not use the read aloud accommodation. So when considering the percentage of accuracy of teachers' expectation by the frequency of which students use the available read aloud support in their L1 in the condition in which the students received the translated test together with the audio support in both languages, we see that students who use the accommodation are less often accurately appraised by their teacher than students who never use the audio support. So while half of the students who did not use the available read aloud accommodation in the L1 were correctly appraised by their teacher, only 20% of the students who did use the audio support were correctly appraised by the teacher. So more than half of the students was underestimated by the teacher when making use of the audio support, indicating that they performed better on the science test than expected by their teacher when they made use of the support provided to them. So the research condition in which students receive the bilingual test and the read aloud accommodation in both languages is also the only category with an extreme case of underestimation, where a teacher expects a student to perform weak, whereas the student got an excellent score on the actual science test. And although this is only one student, this student could count as an example of a false negative. And a false negative in an assessment context is a person classified as failing on the basis of a test's cut score, but who would nevertheless have gone on to succeed in the area for which the test was used as a predictor. So as the consequences of such a judgment are detrimental for the student, false negatives carry considerable weight in validation theory, and researchers like, for example, Kane also caution against any negative evidence when it comes to high-stake testing. So this leads us to question whether false negatives among multilingual learners tend to stay under the radar too often. So what is needed to shape a learning environment that provides fair and valid assessment for multilingual learners is a transition on both axes, as presented in the figure. On the vertical axis, we suggested a shift from a testing culture towards an assessment culture. An assessment culture could be beneficial for all learners. But for multilingual learners, this shift alone is not enough. There needs to be a shift down a second axis, from assessing a learner in only the school language towards an assessment where a learner can use all of his or her multilingual repertoire to demonstrate their knowledge and competences. And our study shows that while teachers often are able to accurately predict students' test scores, discrepancies between actual and expected test scores tend to be more common among linguistic minority groups. And furthermore, our study unveils that underestimation is especially common when multilingual students make use of the L1 audio support provided on a bilingual test. Teachers may be able to accurately predict the science competences of multilingual learners when the assessment procedures do not accommodate for students' linguistic abilities. But when students are able to show their level of competences by moving beyond traditional monolingual testing practices, teacher expectations are no longer accurate predictions of students' science achievements. And this finding shows that linguistic barriers to showcasing content knowledge may especially play a role in creating erroneous expectations among teachers. And in a context such as Flanders, where teacher judgments have strong consequences for referral and transition advice, the importance of so-called assessment literacy among teachers becomes all the more important. So teachers need to be aware of social implications of the assessment practices as well. So an important recommendation to the field is to get more insight into teachers' multilingual assessment literacy and to help them in becoming more aware of the possible pitfalls of assessment of multilingual students and the consequences of invalid assessment practices. So functional multilingual assessment is based on a pedagogical approach, functional multilingual learning that was developed by Cyrus and Van Avermaet in 2014. It is a pedagogical approach in which the multilingual repertoires of pupils are actively used to raise and enhance opportunities for learning. And linguistic repertoires form part of the capital that students bring to the classroom and use as a scaffold, as a didactic capital for learning. And this will not only support learners to master the language of schooling, but also the content of the instruction. So although functional multilingual assessment needs more experimental research, we believe it holds potential to make assessment of multilingual learners more fair and more valid. And this does not mean that there is no place for standardized test and assessment accommodation, but we believe that there is no fixed position in the model. That is why we suggested to shift on to axes depending on, among other factors, the goal of the assessment. Is it summative or formative? And the subject that is being assessed. And the explorative and experimental research that we have conducted so far was concerned with the assessment of content-related subjects, such as science. And for language tests as such, we have not been able to do any experimental studies so far. We can only assume that some of our findings are also relevant in this case. And traditional tests may or may not be able to go as far as, for example, mathematics or science tests. And this is something that is open for debate. We assume that when we want to assess, for example, Dutch reading ability, we cannot shift as far on the continuum without changing the construct that is being assessed. However, this does not mean that we stay colorblind even when we want to assess Dutch reading ability as such. We need to consider individual test takers' characteristics, including the linguistic repertoire of students. We also wonder whether feasibility is harder or easier to achieve in large-scale standardized testing compared to teachers' assessment in the classroom. Teachers, for example, do not have the same technical support as large-scale testing organizations have. Implementing these assessment accommodations without thoroughly considering the heterogeneity of pupil characteristics could in some cases come with a new and added risk of widening the achievement gap even further, making the assessment for some pupils less fair instead of increasing fairness for all test takers. Therefore, accommodations must be implemented and monitored carefully and managed well. And the adoption of one specific learner profile is a decision not to be taken lightly. We thank you for watching this video, and we are looking forward to discussing further on these topics. Thank you.